In 1840, in an isolated plantation outside New Orleans, a French baroness and 9 enslaved people vanished from official records after a mysterious ceremony in the estate's chapel. For over 180 years, the incident remained buried in silence, until a restoration crew discovered a hidden tomb beneath the plantation floor in 2024. What they found inside challenged everything historians thought they knew about one of Louisiana's most prominent families. The Chalice, still stained with dried blood, sat surrounded by 9 bodies arranged in a perfect circle around a 10th, a woman dressed in silk and jewels. No records explained their deaths. No newspaper mentioned their disappearance. The parish registry showed nothing. It was as if an entire night had been erased from history. This is the story of Baroness Marguerite de Lacroix, the 9 people whose names were never recorded, and the forbidden ritual that bound their fates together in death. It's a story about power, desperation, and the lengths people go to preserve secrets that should never see daylight. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Chapter 1. The Discovery. The restoration crew wasn't supposed to find anything. They were hired in March 2024 to repair water damage in the old Lacroix Plantation Chapel, a crumbling structure that had sat abandoned for decades on the outskirts of what is now suburban New Orleans. The building was scheduled for demolition, just another piece of Louisiana's painful past ready to be paved over and forgotten. Marcus Thompson, the foreman, had worked on dozens of antebellum properties. He'd seen slave quarters converted into storage sheds, auction blocks buried under parking lots, and whipping posts disguised as fence posts. Nothing surprised him anymore, but when his sledgehammer broke through the chapel floor on March 18th, revealing a stone staircase descending into darkness, even Marcus felt his breath catch. The air that rose from below was stale and cold, untouched for generations. The crew rigged temporary lights and descended carefully, their footsteps echoing against stone walls. What they found 15 feet below the chapel floor would make national headlines within hours. The tomb was perfectly preserved, a circular chamber about 30 feet in diameter, with walls covered in symbols that mixed Catholic iconography with something older, something that made the lead archaeologist later refuse to discuss what she'd seen. But it was the center of the room that stopped everyone cold. 10 bodies arranged in a precise pattern. 9 formed a circle, all positioned on their knees with their hands clasped as if in prayer. In the center lay a 10th figure, dressed in decomposed silk and wearing jewelry that sparkled even under the harsh LED lights. On a small stone altar beside her sat a silver chalice, ornate and tarnished, with dark stains that testing would later confirm as human blood. The bodies showed no signs of violence. No bullet wounds, no broken bones, no ligature marks. They simply knelt there in the darkness, preserved by the dry, sealed environment, waiting for over a century and a half to be discovered. Marcus immediately called the police, who called the coroner, who called the State Historic Preservation Office. Within 24 hours, the site was swarming with investigators, archaeologists, and historians, all trying to understand what they were seeing. Dr. Patricia Holbrook, a forensic anthropologist from Tulane University, was the first to examine the bodies in situ. "I've worked on mass graves and historical crime scenes," she told reporters later, her voice tight with something between fascination and horror. "But I've never seen anything like this. The arrangement is deliberate, ritualistic, and the preservation suggests the chamber was sealed immediately after. Whatever happened here." The plantation records, such as they existed, identified the property as belonging to the Lacroix family from 1835 to 1862. The main house had burned in 1863 during the Civil War, taking most of the family archives with it. The chapel, built separate from the main compound, had survived, neglected and gradually forgotten as the property changed hands over the decades. But who were these people? Why were they sealed in a tomb beneath a chapel? And what ceremony required 10 people to drink from the same chalice of blood? The answers, investigators would discover, were buried in fragments, scattered across court records, personal letters, and the oral histories of families who had kept secrets for generations. The official history of the Lacroix plantation mentioned nothing unusual. The truth was far more disturbing. The woman in the center was identified through dental records and jewelry markings as Baroness Marguerite de Lacroix, 32 years old at her death, daughter of a French nobleman who had fled to Louisiana after the Revolution. The 9 bodies surrounding her had no identification, no jewelry, no personal effects. They were simply there, anonymous in death as they had been in life. But the chalice told a different story. Engraved on its base were 10 names, 1 matching the Baroness, and 9 others that researchers would spend months trying to trace through fragmentary slave records and auction house ledgers. The discovery raised immediate questions that echoed through academic circles and social media alike. What happened in that chapel in 1840? Why did 10 people drink from a chalice of blood? And why did someone go to such lengths to hide their bodies, sealing them away where they might never be found? The investigation was just beginning, but already one thing was clear. This wasn't just an archaeological find. It was a crime scene nearly 2 centuries old, where the victims and perpetrator might be one and the same. Chapter 2. The Baroness Marguerite de Lacroix arrived in New Orleans in 1835, at the age of 27, carrying a title, a considerable dowry, and a reputation that preceded her like a storm cloud. In the salons of Paris, whispers followed her name, stories about seances, blood rituals, and a dangerous obsession with life beyond death. Her father, desperate to distance the family from scandal, arranged her marriage to Claude Lacroix, a Louisiana sugar planter whose ambitions outweighed his discretion. The marriage was convenient for both parties. Claude needed capital to expand his plantation and social connections to climb New Orleans's rigid hierarchy. Marguerite needed distance from French society and the freedom that came with isolation. The arrangement suited them perfectly. 2 people united not by love but by mutual need, and the understanding that some questions were better left unasked. The Lacroix plantation sat 40 miles upriver from New Orleans, far enough from the city to conduct business without constant scrutiny. The property sprawled across 800 acres of fertile delta land, worked by approximately 90 enslaved people who lived in quarters behind the main house. Claude managed the sugar operation with brutal efficiency, focused entirely on production numbers and profit margins. Marguerite, for her part, kept to herself in the beginning, occupying her days with books, correspondence, and long walks through the cypress swamps that bordered the property. But neighbors began to notice changes within the first year. The Baroness ordered the construction of a private chapel, separate from the main house, built with her own funds and designed according to specifications she refused to explain. She hired workers from New Orleans rather than using plantation labor, and she personally oversaw every detail of the construction, spending hours examining the stone foundation in the cellar that extended deep beneath the chapel floor. Letters from Marie Devereaux, a plantation owner's wife who visited occasionally, described the chapel as unsettling in its beauty, too perfect, too planned, as if every stone was placed with purpose beyond prayer. The building featured high windows that let in little light, walls thick enough to muffle sound, and a door that locked from the inside. Marguerite kept the only key. The Baroness also began selecting certain enslaved people for what she called household service, though the work they performed remained unclear. She chose 9 individuals over the course of several months, 7 women and 2 men ranging in age from 19 to 45. They were moved from the field quarters to rooms near the chapel, separated from the rest of the enslaved community. They ate different food, wore different clothes, and were forbidden from speaking to other workers about their duties. Survivors from the plantation, whose oral testimonies were recorded in the 1930s as part of the Federal Writers Project, remembered those 9 people with a mixture of fear and pity. They walked like ghosts, one elderly woman recalled. The Baroness had them doing something in that chapel, something that changed them. They stopped singing, stopped smiling, just moved through their days like people already dead. What exactly Marguerite was doing remains partially unclear, but fragments of her correspondence with a physician in France suggest she was attempting something she called the Great Preservation, a ritual she believed could grant immortality through the combination of ancient practices and her own aristocratic bloodline. The letters discovered in a French archive in 2018 are disturbing in their calm rationality. She wrote about blood as a vehicle for the soul, about the power of consent in binding souls together, and about her belief that the right combination of will and sacrifice could overcome death itself. Claude either didn't know or didn't care about his wife's activities. His focus remained on the plantation's output, and as long as Marguerite didn't interfere with production, he left her alone. The couple maintained separate lives under the same property line, he managing the brutal machinery of slavery and profit, she pursuing her obsession with immortality. By 1840, Marguerite had been on the plantation for 5 years. The 9 people she had selected had been with her for varying lengths of time, some for months, others for over a year. Neighbors reported seeing lights in the chapel at odd hours, hearing sounds they couldn't quite identify. Not screams exactly, but something rhythmic and unsettling that carried across the cypress swamps on humid nights. Then, in August 1840, everything changed. The Baroness ordered supplies from New Orleans, specific items that raised eyebrows among the merchants who filled her orders. Silver, candles, herbs not commonly used in Louisiana, and specialized knives with curved blades. She also requested a metalworker to craft a chalice according to her exact specifications, with engravings that the craftsman later described as neither French nor English, but something older. Whatever Marguerite was planning, she was preparing methodically. And the 9 people she had chosen, whether they understood or not, were being prepared alongside her. The oral history suggests they knew something was coming, that they moved through those final weeks with the resignation of people who had accepted their fate, who had perhaps even been convinced it was necessary. Now, a comment question for you. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it? I want to know how far these silenced stories reach. Chapter 3. The 9. Their names were recorded in the Chalice, but nowhere else in the official plantation records. Researchers spent months cross-referencing the engravings with slave manifests, auction records, and fragmented ledgers to piece together who these 9 people were and how they came to be in that tomb. The effort was complicated by the intentional vagueness of slavery documentation. Enslaved people weren't listed by full names in most records, just ages, physical descriptions, and occasionally first names without surnames. But through painstaking work, combining the Chalice engravings with oral histories and DNA analysis of living descendants, investigators managed to identify most of them. Celeste, age 38, was purchased at a New Orleans auction in 1836. Records describe her as skilled in herbs and midwifery, which likely meant she served as the plantation's unofficial healer. Survivors' testimonies mention a woman who knew plants and could ease pain, someone the enslaved community trusted but who became isolated after the Baroness took interest in her knowledge. Thérèse and Amélie, ages 22 and 24, were sisters bought together from a failed plantation in Mississippi. They worked in the main house initially, doing laundry and cooking, before Marguerite moved them to chapel service. One testimony describes them as always together, never apart, and notes that in their final months they seemed to move in unison, as if sharing thoughts. Jean-Baptiste, age 45, was born on the plantation, one of the few who knew no other life. He was literate, taught secretly by a previous owner's child, which was both a valuable skill and a dangerous one. The Baroness discovered his ability to read and immediately transferred him to her service. Some letters suggest she used him to translate texts she couldn't read herself, books in Latin and older languages dealing with ritual practices. Samuel, age 19, had been on the plantation only 6 months before being selected. He was strong, healthy, and according to one testimony, too innocent to understand what the devil wanted with him. His youth made his participation particularly tragic. He was barely more than a boy, thrust into something far beyond his understanding. Marie-Louise, age 31, had been a house servant before her selection. Testimonies describe her as quiet and obedient, someone who had learned to make herself invisible to survive. Letters from visitors mention seeing her standing beside the Baroness during social calls, silent and still, like a shadow. Françoise, age 27, was purchased specifically by Marguerite from a Charleston auction in 1839. The sale records note unusual specifications. The Baroness wanted someone of a certain age, with no living children, and with specific physical characteristics. It was a purchase that suggested planning, not convenience. Auguste, age 33, was a carpenter who had helped build the chapel itself. He knew the structure intimately, including the hidden cellar and the stone chamber beneath. Whether he understood what he was building remains unclear, but after the chapel's completion, he was moved into the Baroness's service and forbidden from discussing the construction with anyone. The ninth person proved impossible to identify conclusively. The name on the chalice, Zephyrine, appears nowhere in plantation records. DNA testing suggests she was between 25 and 30 years old at death, but her origins and how she came to the plantation remain mysteries. Some researchers believe she might have been brought in secretly, specifically for the ritual, never officially registered as property. These 9 people lived their final months in a strange isolation. They were housed near the chapel, fed well by plantation standards, and given tasks that kept them away from other enslaved people. Testimonies describe them as changing, becoming quieter, more withdrawn, moving through their days with an eerie calmness that disturbed even the overseers. One survivor, interviewed in 1937, remembered the last time she saw her sister Amélie. She looked at me like she was already gone, like something had taken her soul and left just the body walking around. She didn't cry, didn't beg for help, just smiled sad and said I shouldn't worry, that she was going somewhere better. The testimonies suggest the 9 might have been told they were participating in something transcendent, something that would free them from bondage through spiritual transformation. Whether the Baroness believed this herself or simply used it as manipulation remains unknown. But the psychological control was evident. 9 people somehow convinced or coerced into accepting a fate that would seal them in a tomb forever. The community's reaction was complex. Some saw the selected 9 as cursed, touched by evil. Others saw them as sacrificed, victims of powers they couldn't resist. But everyone agreed on one thing. After they disappeared into that chapel on August 13, 1840, something terrible happened that the plantation tried desperately to hide. The oral histories preserve fragments, stories passed down through generations, details that didn't make it into official records. Talk of screaming that stopped suddenly, of lights that burned all night in the chapel, of Claude Lacroix standing guard at the chapel door the next morning, refusing to let anyone approach, his face pale and his hands shaking. And then, nothing. The Baroness and the 9 simply vanished from all records. No death certificates, no burial notices, no mentions in newspaper obituaries. The plantation continued operating for another 22 years until the Civil War. But those 10 people were erased from its history, as if they had never existed. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching this from, and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Chapter 4. The night of August 13th, 1840. Reconstructing what happened that night required piecing together fragments from multiple sources, testimonies recorded decades later, letters found in family archives, and physical evidence from the tomb itself. The picture that emerged was disturbing in its calm deliberation. The Baroness spent the day in preparation. Witnesses reported seeing her moving between the chapel and the main house, carrying wrapped bundles and speaking to no one. The 9 selected individuals were bathed, dressed in simple white garments, and led to the chapel as the sun set over the cypress swamps. They went willingly, without resistance, a detail that haunted investigators more than if they had fought or tried to escape. Claude Lacroix was absent during the ceremony itself. Multiple accounts place him in New Orleans that day on plantation business, whether by coincidence or deliberate planning. By the time he returned late that night, whatever happened had already concluded. Some letters suggest he found his wife in the main house calm and serene, refusing to explain what had occurred in the chapel. The physical evidence from the tomb tells part of the story. The chalice contained traces of blood from all 10 individuals, mixed together. Chemical analysis showed no poison or drugs, just blood, freshly drawn and shared. The bodies showed no signs of violence, no defensive wounds, no indication of struggle. Whatever killed them did so quietly, leaving them in their kneeling positions around the Baroness. Dr. Holbrook's forensic analysis suggested carbon monoxide poisoning as the most likely cause of death. The tomb's design would have allowed for careful control of airflow, and burn marks on the stone floor suggested braziers had been lit during the ceremony. The chapel's thick walls would have muffled any sounds, and the sealed entrance would have trapped the deadly gas inside. But that explanation, while scientifically sound, didn't account for the ritual elements. Why the blood? Why the specific positioning of the bodies? Why the elaborate preparation and the selection process that had taken months? Letters between Claude and his brother, discovered in a Louisiana Historical Society archive in 2019, provide some context. Written 3 weeks after the incident, Claude described finding the sealed chapel and, against his better judgment, opening it. What he saw drove him to immediately reseal the door and begin constructing a false floor to hide the entrance entirely. "I cannot write of what I witnessed," he wrote. "My wife achieved what she sought, though the cost was beyond reason. The chapel must never be opened again. Let the earth reclaim what we have done." The letter suggests Claude knew about his wife's plans, at least partially, and chose not to intervene. Whether this was cowardice, complicity, or a belief that what his wife was doing fell within her rights as property owner remains debatable. The enslaved community had no such doubts. Testimonies make clear they blame both the Baroness and Claude, seeing them as equally responsible for what happened that night. Over the following days, Claude manufactured an explanation for the disappearances. He told neighbors and authorities that the Baroness had returned to France unexpectedly, taking several house servants with her. It was a thin story, but in an era when white planters' word was rarely questioned, especially regarding their enslaved property, it held. The local sheriff made no investigation. No newspapers reported anything unusual. The plantation continued operating as if nothing had happened. But the enslaved community knew. They saw the sealed chapel, noticed the changed routine, felt the weight of what had been done. The testimony of Marcus, who was 12 years old in 1840 and lived to age 97, preserved in a 1965 recording, describes the atmosphere. Every soul on that plantation knew something evil had happened. We'd see Master Claude standing by the chapel some nights just staring at it. And we'd stay far away, because that ground was cursed with innocent blood. The curse wasn't metaphorical. Several testimonies mention strange occurrences around the chapel in the years that followed. Sounds at night, lights that seemed to move beneath the ground, a coldness that persisted even in Louisiana's summer heat. Whether these were genuine paranormal events or the psychological trauma of a community processing horror, they became part of the plantation's oral history. Claude lived another 22 years, dying in 1862 just before the Union Army reached the area. He never remarried, never spoke publicly about his wife, and maintained the story of her return to France until his death. His will made no mention of the chapel, though it did specify that the building should never be demolished or significantly altered, a condition that successive owners honored, perhaps because they sensed something they couldn't name beneath that floor. The 9 people who died that night, Celeste, Thérèse, Amélie, Jean-Baptiste, Samuel, Marie-Louise, Françoise, Auguste, and Zéphirine, left no written records of their thoughts or feelings. They exist in history primarily as victims, their voices filtered through others' memories and researchers' interpretations. But their presence in that tomb, arranged in ritual formation, suggests they participated in something they believed had meaning, even if that meaning came from manipulation or desperate hope. The Baroness's motivations remain partially opaque. Was she genuinely seeking immortality through some twisted ritual? Was she mentally ill, acting out delusions of occult power? Or was she simply evil, using her position and her enslaved victims to indulge in an experiment that she knew would kill them all? The historical record offers no clear answer, leaving us with a crime that is simultaneously documented and mysterious. A night when 10 people died together in a sealed chamber, bound by blood and ritual, creating a secret that would remain hidden for 184 years. Chapter 5. The Silence. For nearly 2 centuries, the tomb remained undiscovered. The chapel stood above it, gradually deteriorating, while successive owners used the property for various purposes, as a working plantation until 1918, then as timberland, then as a rural estate, and finally as abandoned property awaiting development. Through all these transformations, the secret beneath the chapel floor stayed buried. But the silence wasn't complete. The story survived in fragments, passed down through families descended from the plantation's enslaved community. These oral histories, recorded sporadically over the decades by folklorists and historians, preserved details that official records had erased. They spoke of the night the Baroness killed them all, of 9 souls trapped beneath the chapel, and of a crime that white society had chosen to forget. The preservation of these stories represents its own form of resistance. While Claude Lacroix and subsequent white owners buried the physical evidence, the black community kept the memory alive, ensuring that what happened that August night wasn't completely erased from history. Children were told the stories as warnings, as history lessons, as reminders of what slavery had been capable of. Dr. James Morrison, a historian at Xavier University who has studied the plantation's history, describes this as counter-memory, narratives that exist outside official records but carry their own authority and truth. These families kept alive a story that powerful people wanted dead, and they did it for generations without any proof that they were right. That proof came only in 2024, when Marcus Thompson's sledgehammer broke through the chapel floor. The discovery validated what many descendants had always known, that their ancestors weren't making up stories or exaggerating trauma. The bodies, the chalice, the ritual arrangement, it was all real, preserved in darkness waiting to be revealed. The revelation triggered complex reactions. For descendants of the 9 victims, it brought painful validation. Their ancestors' suffering was no longer just oral history or family legend. It was documented fact, photographed and studied, and reported in newspapers worldwide. But that validation came with renewed trauma, forcing families to confront the reality of how their ancestors died and the fact that justice had never been served. For the Lacroix descendants, few as they were, the discovery was mortifying. The family name, already obscure, became associated with one of the most disturbing slavery-era discoveries in recent history. Several descendants gave statements to the press, expressing horror at what their ancestors had done and donating money to commemoration efforts. Others simply refused to comment, unable or unwilling to engage with a past they hadn't created, but were suddenly forced to represent. The broader historical community struggled with how to contextualize the find. Was this typical of slavery's brutality, or was it exceptional? How many similar secrets might still be buried on other plantations? And how should contemporary society memorialize victims of crimes that were never prosecuted, never officially acknowledged, never mourned? The Lacroix Chapel tomb became a test case for these questions. The Louisiana Historical Commission formed a special committee to determine how to proceed, whether to leave the bodies in situ as a memorial, whether to remove them for proper burial, whether to preserve the site or seal it again. Each option carried implications about memory, respect, and historical justice. Descendants of the 9 victims had the primary voice in these decisions. After months of discussion and several community meetings, they chose to have the bodies removed and buried in a new cemetery, specifically created for enslaved people whose graves had been lost or unmarked. The tomb itself would be preserved as a memorial site, with the names of the 9 prominently displayed and their stories told through interpretive panels and regular ceremonies. The chalice became the subject of intense debate. Some wanted it destroyed as an object of evil. Others argued it should be preserved as evidence and displayed in a museum. Eventually, the decision was made to keep it in a secure archive, available for research but not for public display, honoring both historical documentation and the descendants' discomfort with turning their ancestors' suffering into spectacle. The case also prompted broader conversations about how many similar secrets might remain buried. Slavery generated countless crimes that were never recorded, never punished, never acknowledged. The Lacroix tomb was exceptional in its preservation and dramatic discovery, But the underlying brutality it represented was anything but unique. How many other enslaved people died in circumstances that were hidden, their bodies disposed of in ways meant to erase evidence? Researchers began examining other plantations with renewed scrutiny, using ground-penetrating radar and historical records to look for similar patterns of mysterious disappearances or unexplained deaths. Several investigations are ongoing, though none have yet produced discoveries as dramatic as the Lacroix tomb. The silence that protected the Baroness's crime for 184 years was ultimately broken, not by official investigation or historical research, but by accident and the persistence of oral tradition. If the chapel had been demolished without interior work, if the floor had been removed differently, if the crew hadn't broken through in just that spot, the tomb might have remained hidden indefinitely. And if the descended families hadn't kept the stories alive, the bodies might have been found, but their identities and the context of their deaths would have been lost. If this story has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps the story of the 9 victims reach more people. Chapter 6. Justice Delayed. The discovery of the tomb raised immediate questions about justice. 10 people died in that chapel in 1840, 1 by apparent choice, 9 by coercion or manipulation. A crime was committed, documented, and deliberately hidden. But what does justice look like for crimes committed nearly 2 centuries ago by people long dead? The legal system offered no immediate answers. No criminal charges could be filed against the deceased. No civil lawsuit could recover damages from a family line that had dispersed and held no responsibility for their ancestors' actions. The traditional mechanisms of justice, prosecution, conviction, punishment, were impossible to apply. But descendants and activists argued that justice meant more than legal proceedings. It meant acknowledgement, memorialization, and a commitment to ensuring such atrocities were never forgotten or repeated. It meant giving the 9 victims their full humanity back, telling their stories, and ensuring they weren't reduced to anonymous bodies in a tomb. The state of Louisiana formally apologized in July 2024 during a ceremony at the plantation site attended by descendants, historians, and state officials. Governor Michaela Reynolds stood before the crowd and spoke words that many felt were 184 years overdue. "We acknowledge the crime committed here. We honor the 9 people who died in this place, used and discarded by those with power. We commit to ensuring their story is taught, remembered, and used to build a more just future." The apology was meaningful, but insufficient. As several descendants pointed out, words couldn't undo what happened, couldn't restore the lives taken, couldn't heal the generational trauma that had rippled through their families. But acknowledgement was a necessary first step, a breaking of the silence that had protected this secret for so long. The memorial created at the site became a focal point for commemoration. Designed in consultation with descendants and Black historians, it featured 9 stone pillars arranged in a circle, each bearing one of the victims' names and what little was known about their lives. At the center stood a fountain, water flowing continuously, symbolizing life and cleansing, a counter to the blood ritual that had killed them. The memorial's dedication in October 2024 drew hundreds of people, including descendants from across the country who had never met but were connected by this shared ancestral tragedy. The ceremony blended Christian traditions with West African practices, honoring both the victims' likely religious backgrounds and the cultural heritage that slavery had tried to destroy. Therese Washington, a descendant of Thérèse and Amélie, spoke at the dedication. "My ancestors were sisters. They died together in that tomb, holding on to each other even in death. For 184 years, nobody knew their names. Nobody honored their memory. Today that changes. Today we say their names, we tell their story, and we promise them that they will never be forgotten again." The emotional weight of that ceremony reflected a broader truth, that historical justice, while different from legal justice, carries its own power. Naming victims, telling their stories, creating spaces for mourning and remembrance, these acts matter. They restore dignity that was stripped away. They create historical records that counter official silences. They build connections between past and present that can inform how we address injustice today. Educational initiatives followed the memorial's creation. Local schools began teaching the Lacroix Chapel story as part of Louisiana history curricula, using it to discuss slavery's brutality, the importance of oral traditions, and how historical crimes can remain hidden for generations. University researchers launched oral history projects to document other stories that might be similarly lost, racing against time as the last people who heard first-hand accounts from enslaved people's descendants grew older. The discovery also prompted broader discussions about plantation tourism. Many historical plantations focus on architecture and white owners' lives while minimizing or romanticizing slavery. The Lacroix Chapel became an example of how sites could center enslaved people's experiences instead, making their suffering and resistance the primary narrative rather than a footnote. But justice remained incomplete. The physical remains of the Baroness were cremated according to standard archaeological protocols, her ashes scattered without ceremony, a stark contrast to the elaborate memorial for the 9. Some argued she deserved no commemoration, that even acknowledging her name gave her too much attention. Others felt that her story needed telling as a warning about what happens when power goes unchecked. The 9 victims, Celeste, Thérèse, Amélie, Jean-Baptiste, Samuel, Marie-Louise, Françoise, Auguste, and Zéphirine, are now remembered. Their names are carved in stone. Their story is taught in schools. Descendants can visit a place dedicated to honoring their memory. It's not the justice that should have come in 1840, when those responsible could have been prosecuted and punished, but it's the justice that 2024 could offer: acknowledgement, memorialization, and a commitment to keeping their memory alive. Dr. Morrison, reflecting on the case's resolution, noted, "Justice for historical crimes can't look like contemporary justice. We can't prosecute the guilty or restore what was stolen, but we can break the silence. We can honor the victims, and we can use their stories to build a society that refuses to forget what was done and commits to preventing it from happening again." The Lacroix Chapel story continues to evolve. Researchers are still investigating details about the victims' lives, trying to piece together fuller pictures of who they were beyond their deaths. Descendants continue gathering, building community around their shared connection to this tragedy. And visitors come to the memorial, standing in the circle of 9 pillars, contemplating what happened here and what it means for understanding America's past. Subscribe to the channel to learn about more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Lacroix plantation. See you in the next video.